Alright! Woo! There's gonna be some information transferred today. It's a lot of information. Okay, it's a lot of information. Okay, I'm just gonna tell you. But you need to understand this stuff in order to understand what you're doing. This is the first in a series of videos called The Basics, because this is the stuff everyone who deals with music in this century needs to know. If you've been doing this for years, I would still recommend listening to it again, because reminding oneself of the basics is never a bad idea. Watch this video as many times as you need to understand it. It doesn't mean you're stupid, it means you're smart enough to learn. You don't have to take notes, because my notes will be available to you. The first video in this series is this one, and it is called Studio Anatomy. It's designed to give you a bird's eye view of the studio so you understand how the systems work together to make music happen. Okay? The idea is that at the end of this, you will be less intimidated by a studio environment or a huge music store where you have to go in and purchase what you need to build your own studio. That being said, welcome to Studio Anatomy. The reason I call this Studio Anatomy is because when I was building my first studio in Huntsville, Alabama, on Sparkman, near Jordan Lane, in Seven Pines apartment complex, while working at Space Camp and teaching kids. Anyway, I noticed that the studio has systems that work synergistically together, much like the ones in the human body. And the systems themselves are much like the systems in the human body. So that's how I see it, and that's how I explain it. It makes it a lot easier than just saying you need this, you need that, and you need this. You know I like to teach in context and make things make sense. So the human body is what I use to do that in this case. Now, just like you don't have to be a doctor to have a general understanding of how the human body works, you also don't have to be a seasoned engineer to have a general idea of how the studio works. I'll prove it to you. Watch this. First system we're going to tackle is the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord. First, let's look at the brain. Well, the brain does two things, essentially. The brain processes information, and the brain stores information. In order to take care of the processing function of the brain, your studio has something inside the computer called a CPU, or Central Processing Unit, or processor as it's usually called. Now, this processor, the faster it is, the more it can process information quickly, the more tracks you can run at the same time, the more effects you can put on, all that good stuff. That's determined by your processor, how fast your computer can think, basically. Then you have memory. You're going to need temporary storage, and you're going to need permanent storage. Alright? For temporary storage, we got RAM. Random access memory. Most people just call it memory. When they say memory, they mean RAM. To take care of the long-term and or permanent storage, we got the hard drive. Right? You can have up to 4 of these in most computers. And all of this good stuff we just talked about connects to something we call the motherboard.
So you take all this stuff, you slap it together on a motherboard, you take the motherboard and you put it inside a housing made of metal. You call that a computer. Then you take the computer, you slap it in your studio, and what do you got? The central nervous system. I had to tell you everything, come on.
Primarily responsible for sending and receiving electrical signals. That's all it does at the end of the day is send and receive electrical signals. Those electrical signals have to be interpreted on both ends by the computer, the peripherals of the computer, and the devices in your studio. So now that we've taken care of the central nervous system, we have to also account for the peripheral nervous system. Yet as a peripheral nervous system in the human body, it's basically comprised of the nerves that travel to and from the central nervous system. That's your MIDI cables. Now, I know that the computer is capable of sending audio and MIDI data, but for the purposes of making this simpler and understanding it better, we're going to split your cabling systems up into 2 parts. One being MIDI and the other being audio. MIDI cables, audio cables. We'll talk about the audio cables in a second. Alright, now let's move on to the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is comprised mainly of 2 things. Cardio, meaning heart, and vascular, from a word meaning vessels, which are your blood vessels. Veins and arteries comprise most of the blood vessels. In the studio, your heart is your audio interfacing system. So the reason I say audio interfacing system and not audio interface is because you can have more than one audio interface. I personally have two. Some people have many. It depends on what you need. For instance, if you had to record an entire band at the same time, 2 ins and 2 outs are not going to do it for you in that case. You're going to need more. Sometimes entire big bands are recorded at the same time. In live situations, sometimes bands, singers, you name it, it's all recorded at the same time. Therefore, you would need simultaneous input of many, many channels. Okay? You might have to have a lot of interfaces to do that, but whatever your arrangement of interfaces is, that's your heart. Now, the blood is also considered part of the cardiovascular system. The blood is audio. So your audio cabling is your veins and your arteries. Now the veins and the arteries carry blood to and fro the heart. Veins carry blood toward the heart, arteries carry blood from the heart. In your studio, this is the same cable, it just goes in 2 different directions depending on where it's plugged in. Okay, so we got the nervous system and we got the cardiovascular system all taken care of. What do we need now? The skeletal system. Yeah. See, without the skeletal system, me and you, we'd be worthless piles of flesh on the ground. Just a pile of worthless flesh. Okay? The skeleton is what keeps everything where it's supposed to be. This is very important. It might sound mundane, but it's super important because it has a lot to do with your workflow. Where everything is supposed to be should be determined by your workflow. How do you like to work? What do you do every day? Keep that at arm's length. What don't you do very much at all? Keep that across the studio if you want to, but make it so when you are using it, you can bring it closer and use it until you're done. Very, very important. We'll talk about workflow a lot. So, what's your skeletal system? Well, let's see. You got your desk, okay? You got your racks, and you got your stands. That's mic stands, guitar stands, keyboard stands, right? Everything that keeps things where it's supposed to be. I even have a stand for my computer in my studio. Where do I keep that? Right next to my drums, which also are on a stand, right? So I keep my computer right next to my drums because when I'm using the drums, I don't want to have to get up from the drums and go back to the computer every time I need to get another take. So I have my laptop right next to my drums on a stand, so that while I'm using my drums, I can remote control my studio, which is already another video there for you to learn how to do, from the drum seat. I don't have to get up from the drums until I'm done recording drums. That's kind of important to me, so I set up my skeleton to make that happen. You feel me? Things that interrupt your workflow also interrupt your creative process because it's hard to create when it's hard to create. Now, here's the next thing. What's the largest organ in the body? That is your skin. The skin not only repels things that are not supposed to get into the body, but it also absorbs things that benefit the body. Skin protects you from the outside world, protects the outside world from something really gory, and so it reflects and it absorbs. Okay, acoustic treatment does the same thing. When sound comes out of your speakers, it hits your walls and your ears, and then it hits your ears again when it comes back from your walls. Your walls are part of your studio, not around your studio. Your walls take care of the reflection part. Most of what you're going to need is absorption. I'll get into more of the specifics of treating a room in another video. But right now I'll say that acoustic treatment is mostly done with absorption panels. Because you want to hear what you hear directly from the speakers. The thicker the absorption panel, the more low frequencies it's going to absorb. Whatever the case, your studio is going to give you a truer representation of your sound after some judicious acoustic treatment. Okay, last thing, and I swear I'm done. This is the last thing in studio anatomy, okay? The lungs. Okay, I know you're like, okay, what's the lungs, man? Jeez. I know, but it's a video. You can watch it a million times, okay? Now, in the human body, the lungs deliver oxygen to the blood. Without oxygen in the blood, it will become useless and eventually stop flowing altogether and cause death. In your studio, your lungs are your electrical system, your network of power strips, power conditioners, and electrical cables that make everything run. Okay, so there's two things I want to suggest here when it comes to your lungs or your electrical system. One of which is rackable power supplies. They make power strips that you can put into a rack. Sometimes they're one rack space, sometimes they're two rack spaces, but they fit inside your rack. And clearly if they fit inside your rack, they're also made for studio application and therefore have better power conditioning than most of the power strips you're going to find at any store. It also keeps your cable short and off the floor, because if you put that in the top of the rack, which is where I usually put it, all the stuff you have in the rack can plug into it, and then you're basically plugging the entire rack into the wall instead of each little piece, thereby tripping over and of course killing yourself. And for número dos, a UPS. Not that kind of UPS. Yeah, you're probably going to need that kind of UPS too, because you're going to order stuff and it's going to come in, but not that kind of UPS. You're going to need an uninterruptible power supply. Why? Because power is not granted, people. You can have a power outage, and then what? So a UPS is a backup power source for your studio. The UPS plugs into the wall. The studio plugs into the UPS. So if the power from the wall should go out for any reason, you switch to the power from the UPS, which at least gives you time to shut everything down, make sure all your work is saved, and wait until the power comes back on. At best, your power will come back on before the UPS is depleted, and you haven't been interrupted at all. Hence the name, uninterruptible power supply. So in addition to data backup, which I would strongly suggest, and we'll talk about in another video, I would also suggest power backup. Back that thing up. Alright, that's it. That's all the systems I want to talk about today. If you have anything that I haven't thought of, feel free to hit me up at bluetooth@bluetooth.net. That's BLU2TH. Make sure you spell it that way, or I ain't gonna get it. Thus concludes Studio Anatomy. I'd recommend watching this a few times just to internalize all this data before I give you some more, which is what I'm gonna go do.